Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 602, The Bureaucrats, Part 1. When I was putting together episode 600, I got a couple of really interesting listener requests that, as I sat and thought about it, I decided would make for a better full episode than just a short section in the Q&A. So here's the first of them, with credit to new patron Zeta. What's the deal with Japan's bureaucracy? Why does it run the way that it does? And how did it, somewhat uniquely among a lot of Japanese political institutions, survive the transition to the modern Japanese state of today? I think this is a great question, despite the fact that as soon as I mention the phrase Japanese bureaucracy, I am then legally obligated to make an America-centric comparison to our own bureaucracy here in the glorious US of A, less competence and more slowly having an existential breakdown as you wait in line at the DMV. I am pretty sure that comparison is mandated in the post-war Constitution, right next to Article 9. Now, I don't know how our friends in other parts of the world feel, but here in the USA, when someone says bureaucracy, the image that is conjured up is not one of competence. And admittedly, that fact in and of itself is very political. It is definitely true that there are incompetent bureaucrats in the US, as there are everywhere, but the idea that government bureaucracy in and of itself is inherently inefficient and bad is a political narrative. That rhetoric was consistently repeated by, in particular, the Reagan-era Republican Party in the 1980s as part of the deregulation agenda that Reagan wanted to pursue. My own personal and highly anecdotal experience has been varied. In my experience, Seattle's city bureaucracy is kind of a mix, Washington's state-level bureaucracy, honestly pretty good, and the federal bureaucracy, slow but generally workable given how understaffed it can be. My point is that regardless of reality, here in America, the word bureaucracy tends to conjure up this image of incompetence, slowness, unnecessary red tape, and so forth, but that is very much a result of the politics of this country. However, it also doesn't change the fact that the associations with that term generally are not good, and that simply is not the case in East Asia because the history of bureaucracy itself is very different. That history, of course, begins with China. I am really hitting all the classic standbys in this episode. Anyway, it probably will not shock anyone who's been listening to this podcast for a while, who knows anything about Japanese history, or indeed who has looked at a map at some point in their life, to know that Chinese models were very influential on Japan for a long time. The bureaucracy, of course, was no exception. So any history of the Japanese bureaucracy must begin with the question, why does China have such a long history with bureaucracy? This is not a Chinese history podcast, so I will try and keep things brief here. To start with, China, as we expert academic types always so skillfully note, is quite big. Yes, thank you, hold the applause, but I will take my honorary doctorate for my keen insights, if you please. Anyway, ruling large empires always presents a challenge for the ruler, almost up there with cooking a small fish. That's a deep cut that only a few of you will get. Anyway, the first unified dynasties of China that we have any sort of records of, the Zhou, Qin, and Han, had to figure out how to manage things. Just to give you an idea of timelines here, the Zhou ruled China from about 1000 BCE to 221 BCE. In Japan, we're still deep in unrecorded prehistory here, while in other parts of the world this lines up pretty well with, for example, the biblical kingdoms of Israel, or the latter dynasties of Pharaonic Egypt after the New Kingdoms, or, for the very latter half, the early Roman Republic. The Qin and Han dynasties, meanwhile, run from 221 BCE to 206 CE, so from there to roughly the peak of the Roman Empire, and in Japan, probably the state of the early emperors was just starting to come together, right as the Han dynasty was falling apart. So, these early rulers of China had two basic options open to them for governing their territories. The first was to decentralize, relying on delegating power to locals who could run things over their sprawling empire on their behalf. That way you didn't need to be constantly running decisions back to the court in far-off Chang'an, modern Xi'an, whenever those damn Xianbei tribesmen in Mongolia started to get uppity or whatever. That model of decentralization, of course, is time-tested around the world. The Abbasid caliphs who reigned for 500 years from Baghdad used it, and of course it's basically how the feudal system in Europe tended to operate, in as much as we can generalize about feudalism. In China in particular, much like Europe, the rulers who pursued this option, and the Zhou dynasty in particular relied on this a great deal, though the emperors of Qin and Han did as well, made use of a provincial aristocracy with military roots who were pretty naturally suited to taking on a provincial manager role, much as the military aristocracy of Europe, your knights, your dukes, and such did. Without getting too deep into it here, the Zhou dynasty in particular was basically governed as a sort of decentralized feudal state, with the king of Zhou, they were not yet using the title Huangdi, which we translate as emperor, delegating various regional rulers to govern territories on his behalf. Unfortunately, there's a big problem with this sort of approach, as anyone casually familiar with Chinese history, or really most of history, knows. Those regional rulers, particularly once they became hereditary regional rulers, quickly realized that there was no particular reason they should be taking orders from some far-off ruler at all. Thus, for most of the Zhou dynasty, the Zhou kings were ostensibly in charge, but practically the country was divided. After a certain point, the regional rulers even started to call themselves kings too. The subsequent Qin and Han dynasties were comparatively more centralized, but still had this powerful regional nobility to contend with, who had to be accommodated. In the end, the Han dynasty in particular would be undone by the growing influence of these noble regional families. It was to serve as a counterweight to the regional nobility that these early emperors began turning to the other way you can govern a powerful empire, a centralized bureaucracy. This was not an overnight transition, and for example, under the Han, you do not see some of the hallmarks of the later imperial Chinese system, particularly the robust system of examinations used to select bureaucrats. Instead, jobs were based on recommendation letters from the noble families, so the nobility still had a lot of power over the bureaucracy. Even so, this was an important step in giving the emperors of China more ability to actually exert control over their state, and, as a bit of an aside, this is another dynamic that is not unique to China at all. In particular, the kings of late medieval and early modern Europe, most notably in France, constructed their own powerful state bureaucracies as a way to rein in the power of their nobilities as well. The idea of a bureaucracy, one run by and thus loyal to the emperor as a counterweight to the provincial power of the aristocracy, just makes sense. It's a separate group of people you can count on for more unbiased advice and assistance, operating theoretically in the interests of the ruler who employs them, rather than regional power holders. After the fall of the Han dynasty, China entered a long period of disunity that is extremely fascinating, which we are going to yada yada right past to arrive at the Tang dynasty, alongside the Han, one of the golden ages of imperial China, running from about 600 to 900 CE. The Tang maintained and expanded the existing imperial bureaucracy, but they too were beholden to the power of the provincial nobility, but then a funny thing happened. You see, the emperors of the Tang dynasty were, for reasons that we don't really have the time or room to get into, very successful at binding the old aristocracy of China to their whims, and that meant when the Tang, as all Chinese dynasties eventually did, went down in flames, a lot of the old aristocracy that had by this point endured for almost 2,000 years went down with them. The collapse of the Tang dynasty wiped out a lot of the power base of these old aristocratic families, and in many cases killed the families themselves off. And this meant that when a new dynasty, as they always do, rose from the ashes, the Song dynasty, its emperors had a lot less competition from those powerful aristocrats than their predecessors had. And it is not a coincidence that under the Song, the imperial bureaucracy of China would begin to take on the form it would hold all the way to the Xinhai Revolution in 1911 and the final end of Imperial China. This new bureaucracy was quite a bit more powerful and centralized than its predecessors, selected now only using a rigorous exam system managed directly by the imperial throne, and schooled in a government-approved ideological orthodoxy which we today call Neo-Confucianism, a refining of older Confucian ideas, into a sort of complete systemic worldview that addressed basically every aspect of society, from politics to economics to religion to gender and beyond. So, we have just spent a lot of time talking about China, but why does this matter for Japanese history? Well, let's review our timeline of early Japanese history. From what we know, the earliest organized kingdoms in Japan were coming together by around 200 CE during the very late Han Dynasty, where the imperial bureaucracy was already playing some part in governing China. The early state of Japan's emperors, in particular, was more of a coalition of aristocratic families that the emperor had nominal control of, and sometimes not even that. And so starting in 645 CE, during the early years of the Tang Dynasty, you see a series of reforms intended to change this, weakening the power of the aristocratic clans and centralizing more authority under the imperial family. The model for how to do this, how to centralize power, was of course taken from the contemporary government of China, from the Tang emperors, including their imperial bureaucracy. So, because I maintain some aspirations that people will find this interesting, I am not going to do a long-form dissection and comparison of the Tang bureaucracy relative to that of classical Japan. It would just be too much. To put it simply, what we call the Ritsuryo system in Japan, so called because it consists of a series of laws establishing the Ritsu, the penal code, and the Ryo, the administrative code, came together from the mid-600s onward through the next century and a half and change. Broadly, it resembled the structure of Tang Dynasty China, with a series of departments run by advisors who reported to the emperor. But the structure of those divisions was a bit different in China and Japan. The Tang and every subsequent dynasty would rely on a system of three major departments: the Chancellery, which drafted laws, the Secretariat, which implemented them, and the Department of State Affairs, which oversaw the 6 ministries: war, justice, works, religious rights, revenue, and criminal law. Collectively, this was the structure for how the empire was managed, though of course, over time, things would shift, there'd be slight changes in the overall structure. In Japan, however, there were only 2 divisions at the highest level of the bureaucracy: the Dajokan, the Grand Council of State, and the Jinkikan, or Ministry of Religious Affairs. The Jinkikan was theoretically higher ranking, but the Dajokan, of course, handled more day-to-day administration. The Dajokan, in turn, was composed of 3 senior advisors: the Daijo Daijin, a sort of shadow rank for the senior-most of the imperial advisors, the Sadaijin, or Minister of the Left, and the Udaijin, or Minister of the Right, with left outranking right in this scheme. Underneath them were a host of Grand, Middle, and Junior Counselors, Dainagon, Chunagon, and Shonagon, respectively, plus controllers of the left and right, the Sadaiben and Udaiben. Collectively, they managed 8 ministries: war, justice, treasury, people's affairs, ceremony, civil service, the imperial household, and the Ministry of the Center, which managed the affairs most directly related to running the country in the imperial house. Beneath them were the various kokshi, the provincial governors appointed from the aristocracy for fixed terms out in the provinces, who had their own mini-bureaucracies to help them manage things out in the far-flung regions. Now, you might hear all this and think, doesn't that sound a bit unnecessarily bloated? And yes, unlike the end of the Tang Dynasty, there was no grand die-off at any point of the Japanese aristocracy. That aristocracy had to be subordinated by a combination of carrots and sticks, and by sticks I mean a few purges and a couple civil wars. I have heard it said that the Heian bureaucracy was at least in part a sort of jobs program intended to keep the surviving loyal aristocrats gainfully employed and offer them ways to compete for higher and higher positions, thus channeling their ambitions into, if not necessarily a productive direction, then at least a not actively harmful one. Like the Tang emperors, the emperors of Japan did attempt to implement a more merit-based exam system, but, like the emperors of Tang, they were not very successful. All positions ended up being based on recommendations of merit, which in reality meant they were much more about who you knew rather than what you knew. There were, of course, eventual attempts, several of them, to implement an exam system, but like in China, the power of exam-based appointees was always limited by the need to appease the aristocrats. Certainly, our understanding of this period seems to reflect a sort of bureaucracy run amok and existing largely for its own sake. For example, in his monumental The World of the Shining Prince, one of the greats of Japanese history, Ivan Morris, describes the process for announcing a new decree from the imperial throne. Quote, "The procedure for issuing imperial decrees provides an example of Heian bureaucracy rampant. When the Great Council of State have decided on a proposal, they submit it to the emperor, whose secretaries rewrite it as a state document drafted, of course, in Chinese. After the emperor has read it, he automatically approves and signifies this by writing the day of the month in his own hand, the year and the month having already been filled in by the secretaries. The draft is then sent to the Ministry of Central Affairs. The minister makes a report of acknowledgement to the emperor. He then examines the document and, approval again being automatic, inscribes the Chinese character for proclaim under his official title. The next stop is the office of the senior assistant minister, who, after the usual delays, writes the character for received. The next procedure is followed by the junior assistant minister, except that he writes the character perform. Now the draft goes back to the scribe's office where it is copied. The document is then sent back to the Great Council of State, where the major counselor makes a report of acknowledgement. Next, the emperor sees the document. This time he writes the character approved and returns it to the Great Council. Here the document is thoroughly scrutinized and, if no stylistic mistakes are found, it is sent to the scribe's office for multi-copying. Each copy is jointly signed by the Daijo Daijin and all other officials who are concerned with the matter at hand, and then sent to the palace for the ceremony of affixing the Great Imperial Seal. Now finally the decree can be promulgated. Since, often as not, it is concerned with some questions such as the type of headdress that an official of the third rank may wear at court, we can judge the prodigious waste of time and effort involved in government procedure. Now, technically this bureaucracy continued to operate until the 1870s. In practice, though, by about 1,000 years ago, its relevance was in steep decline. In part, that was because of the enormous bloat that this bureaucracy operated under. In part, it was because of the systemic problems of the Heian system itself, which was constantly being undermined by rival aristocratic families looking to carve off tax-free private estates, by members of the imperial family looking to shore up the throne's power by doing the same, by powerful shrines and temples looking for their own independent power bases, so they were less reliant on the charity of the throne. As a result, over the course of about 500 years, from 1000 to 1500 CE, the Kyoto bureaucracy went from managing the country to being basically sidelined by local interests of others, especially, of course, the rising warrior class. These samurai, concentrated in the open plains of eastern Japan, set up their own parallel government with its own bureaucracy, of course, which we won't get into here because I'm really hoping not to let this thing turn into, well, I wrote two-parter here originally. It's actually going to be a three-parter, of course. I will just note that, like the Kyoto bureaucracy, the ones set up by the warrior governments of the Hojo in Kamakura and then the Ashikaga in the Muromachi area of Kyoto were generally restricted to aristocratic families, that is, other samurai clans, especially those with a proven track record of loyalty. So, like the Kyoto bureaucracy, arguably part of the point here was for bureaucratic positions to serve as a reward for the ambitious among the aristocracy to compete over, thus keeping them occupied and unable to do things like, foment a rebellion. The important thing for us here is that neither of these bureaucracies ever reached the levels of centralization or, frankly, efficiency that you see in Song Dynasty China and beyond. And again, the obvious reason here is that unlike in Imperial China, there was no mass die-off of the old aristocracy that made it possible for either emperors or the early shoguns, the leaders of the warrior class, to expand their own power by centralizing the state. Instead, the bureaucracy remained limited in power and scope, and I really cannot stress this enough, was often a sinecure for aristocrats intended to keep them feeling rewarded and thus busy. There was never anything analogous to China's merit-based system. You do see the idea of merit-based promotion pop up on occasion. For example, the samurai warlord Asakura Toshikage wrote in his advice to his descendants in 1480, quote, "Do not give a command post or administrative position to anyone who lacks ability, even if his family has served the Asakura for generations." 100 years later, another samurai warlord, Chosokabe Motochika, emphasized that promotions and income bonuses for samurai should be based on talent, not reputation or family status. It's interesting to note that these recommendations for merit promotion both come from the period of civil war, when, from 1467 to 1600, the central governments of both the Kyoto court and the Ashikaga shogunate failed completely, and the country descended into constant warfare, first at a very low level, then with increasing intensity as time went on. And this is another of those funny patterns of history that doesn't just apply to Japan. If you judge the idea of merit promotion by social mobility, the ability of someone to climb the social hierarchy very quickly, then arguably, war and conflict is great for social mobility. Put another way, people tend to be much more open to promoting whoever is capable when the alternative is getting your butt whooped in a war and having your house burned down. It's during periods of stability when you see less of a focus on merit because the system is so stable you just don't need talented people as much. And indeed, as peace began to return to Japan in the 1590s, you see a return to a more stable and more static social hierarchy, including in the idea of leadership. For example, let's take the Osaka Jochu Kabegaki, the wall writings of Osaka Castle, essentially a series of edicts put up by the second of the unifiers of Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, in 1595, after he brought the whole country under his control. Gone here is any reference to merit. Instead, there are a bunch of regulations around, for example, who is or is not allowed to ride in a palanquin carried by porters instead of walking. If you're curious, it's mostly Hideyoshi's senior-most allies, but there are exceptions if you are old and sick. The code also concludes, of course, with, "Conform to the limitations of your fief. In all things, your actions should be consistent with your standing." In other words, don't get uppity. This trajectory continued under the rule of the Tokugawa shoguns. Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors constructed what is, by pretty much any conceivable metric, the most elaborate pre-modern bureaucracy in Japanese history, so much so that you often see scholars of this period refer to the Tokugawa years as centralized feudalism. The shogun, of course, had a personal bureaucracy through which he governed his massive allotment of land, 4.2 million koku, or bushels of rice worth, over 400% more than the next wealthiest lord in all the realm. That bureaucracy consisted of his advisors, the Roju and Wakadoshi-yori councils, plus various bugyo, magistrates, handling things like finance, religious affairs, and so on. Under them were various chamberlains and other officials managing the complex web of Edo Palace itself, plus the machibugyo, the officials who governed the cities the shogun ruled directly, Edo itself, plus Osaka, Kyoto, Nara, Nikko, Ise, and Nagasaki. That whole arrangement was then duplicated in miniature over all the feudal domains of Japan, somewhere between 260 to 300 of them, depending on the precise year we're talking about and definition you use. The Buke Shohato, the code of laws promoted for the samurai houses by the shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu in 1635, explicitly ordered the regional lords to do this. Every domain had to base its system of administration and laws on the model provided by the shogun's own rule from his capital of Edo. And I mean, honestly, even if it hadn't been the law, I imagine most of the regional feudal lords, the daimyo, would have just copied the shogun's homework anyway. Who wants to reinvent the wheel? But this bureaucracy, too, wasn't merit-based. Positions were largely hereditary, and based, in the case of the shogun's bureaucracy, on both family status and whether or not the families involved were Fudai daimyo, ones with histories of loyalty that predated the Tokugawa seizure of power. For the bureaucracies of the regional daimyo lords themselves, more or less the same pattern held, with the exception that in their cases it was loyalty to the daimyo's family specifically that counted. Merit, in turn, didn't count for much at all, particularly after the first few decades of the shogunate, when opportunities for those with lower ranks to distinguish themselves began to dry up. After all, it's hard to argue with success on the battlefield, but if you're a feudal lord, are you really going to risk pissing off your higher-ranking, long-standing supporters by promoting some plebeian over them just because he was good at itemizing your bills or something? There were some domains that attempted more merit-based reforms, and on the national level, Matsudaira Sadanobu, one of the shogun's roju, or senior counselors, tried to implement a version of China's imperial exam system in the 1780s to grade the shogun's own followers as a part of his sweeping attempts to reform the government that we collectively call the Kansei reforms. Sadanobu pretty openly said he drew inspiration from the Chinese system and its emphasis on merit over social status. His hope was to implement the exams at schools which trained the shogun's retainers, and then use the exam status to determine positions going forward. However, Matsudaira's reforms were very short-lived, and his political enemies, driven in part by their fear of this new merit-based promotion system, because it could cost them their job and status, eventually succeeded in forcing his retirement and shutting the whole thing down. And this was the fate of basically every merit-based reform to the Tokugawa bureaucracy to the extent that they were ever tried in the first place. And that, at long last, brings us to the birth of Japan's modern bureaucracy, which is bound up with one of the most turbulent eras of its history, the collapse of the Tokugawa system and the birth of the Japanese Empire. That collapse, which took the form of a slow-motion train wreck over the course of the 1850s and 1860s, was of course precipitated most dramatically by the forcible end of the Sakoku policy, the closed country edicts that restricted trade with the outside world in order to maintain the careful balance of power created by the shoguns. A combination of lack of leadership and institutional paralysis meant that the shogunate was never really able to rise to the challenge of European and American gunboat diplomacy as foreign ships began to enter Japan's waters and demand trade at any cost. Eventually, the leadership paralysis would destroy the shogunate altogether. If you read modern histories of this period, you will see a varied discussion on the factors that led to the collapse of the Tokugawa system, its inability to rise to this challenge, and of course the eventual abolition of feudalism. This is, as we've discussed, a very complicated subject that has been endlessly covered and rehashed from different perspectives and angles and points of emphasis. But here's the thing, if you read the writings of the people who spearheaded the movements that eventually brought feudalism down, they had a much more simple analysis of what was happening. Yes, the economic situation was bad, the militaries of the feudal domains and the shogun himself were unprepared, foreign relations were mismanaged, but all of it stemmed from a simple issue. The people in charge lacked merit and had no talent, and needed to be replaced with people who had those things. If you look, for example, at the autobiography of Fukuzawa Yukichi, who began his life as the son of a low-ranking samurai in one of the old domains, but would go on to be one of the great intellectuals of post-war Japan, you can really feel his frustration at what he perceived as the unfair social system holding him back. Fukuzawa depicts himself as a bright kid, and I mean, given his later life, there's no reason to doubt that, but of course, he also has a vested interest in portraying himself that way, who was constantly treated as less than his higher status peers. He received less attention from teachers at the domain school, he was forced to sit in the rear of the classroom where it was harder to ask questions or hear lectures. Even in an autobiography written decades after the fact, reading his words, you can feel his irritation at having to yield the spotlight to people who believed they were better than he was, only because of their family names. Nor was Fukuzawa's frustration unique. Remember, most of the leaders of the early Meiji state were from the middle to lower ranks of the samurai class, and they shared the experience of being forced to play second fiddle to their social betters. That experience was reflected in their vision for fixing society's problems. Sakamoto Ryoma, one of the great figures of the Restoration, included in his 8-point plan for the future of Japan a call that, quote, men of ability among the lords, nobles, and people at large should be employed as counselors, and traditional offices of the past, which have lost their purpose, should be abolished. That frustration was reflected in turn in the foundational document of the new Meiji government that emerged from the ashes of the Tokugawa system. The Charter Oath, signed by the new Meiji Emperor in April 1868, could be read as emphasizing the importance of merit over social status in 4 of its 5 sections. Quote, "Deliberative assemblies shall be widely established and all matters decided by open discussion. All classes high and low shall be united in vigorously carrying out the administration of affairs of state. The common people, no less than the civil and military officials, shall be allowed to pursue their own calling so that there may be no discontent, and evil customs of the past shall be broken off, and everything based on the just laws of nature." All of these seem to emphasize allowing anyone who wanted to participate in government to have a hand in it, and that's very much a product of the frustrations of those young samurai at the old status system. And here we already see the roots of the modern Japanese bureaucracy, which was explicitly created to address precisely this issue. Putting people, really I should say in the eyes of the Meiji leaders, men of merit into positions of power and authority, was their first objective in creating a stable government. Of course, this didn't happen right away. The first 3 years of the new regime were more focused on making sure that it didn't follow the footsteps of so many revolutionary governments before it and after it in imploding immediately after taking power. You do see a few wings of what would become the new imperial bureaucracy start to come together before 1871, most notably the Finance Ministry, 1868, Foreign Ministry, 1869, and the Hokkaido Development Agency, the forerunner of the Takumusho, or Ministry of Colonial Affairs, in that same year. But for the most part, it was not until the formal legal abolition of all of the old feudal domains in August of 1871 that the central government began to build the framework for a truly centralized bureaucracy. These early bureaucracies were staffed primarily by people chosen for their established loyalty to the new Meiji regime. Merit in the early years did take a backseat to proven trustworthiness regardless of the rhetoric. That the Meiji bureaucracy, and really the Japanese bureaucracy as it exists today, truly began to come together in the mid-1870s, primarily under the direction of what we might call the autocratic wing of the Meiji leadership. Remember, the coalition that overthrew the shogunate and established this new government was varied and diverse, containing several political wings that didn't really agree on much beyond the Tokugawa system doesn't work anymore. Much of the 1870s was taken up with struggles between these wings over that most important of revolutionary questions. Now that the revolution is over, who's actually in charge? The winning team, so to speak, were a group of former samurai, because they themselves had decided to abolish samurai status, primarily from the old feudal domain of Choshu, which had been one of the leaders of the anti-Tokugawa movement. These men had been radicalized by the experiences of the 1860s into a view of global politics as primarily a competition for power, where the only thing that mattered for a country was being strong enough to defend its interests. From that group emerged a leader, Ito Hirobumi, who would go on to be one of the most important political figures in Japanese history. It was Ito who, spending time in Europe in the 1870s to discover the roots of European political and economic power, fell into the orbit of German and Austrian lawyers like Rudolf von Neist, Albert Mosse, and Lorenz von Stein. These men were happy to talk Ito's ear off about the centralized and autocratic regimes they had set up in Austria-Hungary and the new German Empire, and they impressed upon their pupil a few key lessons. Ito would return to those lessons a decade later, and to those same men, when drafting the constitution for the new Empire of Japan. But by that time, he'd already learned, he felt, what he needed to know from his German-speaking mentors about how to form a national bureaucracy. They had taught them that the bureaucrats must be responsible not to the people, who were weak-willed and easily changeable in their views. Only the emperor could command them dispassionately and with a long-term vision for the future. Second, and I imagine it must have been nice for Ito to hear this given how it confirmed his assumptions from his Confucian upbringing and experience as a low-ranking samurai, they had to be selected on merit, ideally using a highly competitive civil service exam. Ito would bring precisely this vision home, fuse it to older ideas inherited from the Tokugawa state, and create what became the modern Japanese bureaucracy. And we'll take a look at what that looks like next week. For now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the show on Patreon. Thanks very much to new patrons Nicholas and Paul for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 2.